Now, good evening, everybody. You're all incredibly welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. Now, our guest this week is Paul O'Kane, the Chief Communications Officer with the DAA. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having us, sir. It's very kind of you to ask.
Very happily. I was only thinking this afternoon, this is officially the closest I've been to the airport in about 14 months. So I'm delighted to have you here.
Yeah, you're not the only one. I haven't been off the island. I've been to the airport a lot, but I haven't been off the island since December of 2019, unless you count regular walks on Boot Island and a boat trip around Rathlin, neither of which I do.
Both sound pretty wonderful. But anyway, it's to everyone who's here with us this evening, thanks so much for taking the time. If you've got questions for Paul as we go through the evening, please do type them in. But I guess, Paul, I'd love to just start by going back a couple of centuries and kind of looking at kind of 1785 onwards. I'd love you just to tell me a little bit about life, talking about flying machines, balloons, and kind of some of the key figures around that time. I'm thinking Crosby, Fitzgerald, and Sadler.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Ireland, in a way, has always sort of punched above its weight in aviation terms. You know, if you think about it objectively, we're kind of a little island off the coast of a larger island, which is off the coast of Europe. And also we were kind of, when you think about it, back then, back in the 18th century, we were probably kind of quite far from the madding crowd. And the first manned flight was the Montgolfier brothers in Paris, and that was I think it was in October of 1783. And very, very quickly afterwards, just about a year and 3 months afterwards, a guy called Richard Crosby, who was a kind of an Anglo-Irish aristocrat. Crosby was very, very interested in ballooning. And Crosby was the first Irish man to fly. He tested his balloon several times, and he initially apparently found it very difficult to get anyone to go up on the balloon. Not surprisingly, possibly. Mm-hmm. He was the first flight in Ireland was on January the 19th, 1785, and he flew from Ranelagh Gardens to actually where I am here this evening in Clontarf. I'm not exactly sure where he landed in Clontarf. I think he may have landed on Dollymount Strand. Crosby's not as celebrated as he should be, really, given that he is the first Irishman to fly. There's there is a little small park in Ranelagh, which is named after him, I think now, and does have a little statue or sculpture in there, which that's only been unveiled relatively recently. Frank McNally, the Irish Times journalist, wrote about Crosby a few times, and I think from memory was asked to unveil that statue. So Crosby was the first Irishman to fly, and then the first person to go across the Irish Sea in a balloon was a guy called William Sadler, and he did that in July of 1817, and that was in the summer of 1817, and that would have been a big trip back then in terms of, if you think about it, it's quite a long distance. You've got to think about the winds, and he was being very innovative at the time. No one would have done it before. He wouldn't have known where effectively he would have ended up. And it's funny, when you fast forward more than a century later, everyone always remembers that Amelia Earhart landed in Derry on her transatlantic flight and actually didn't really know where she'd landed. And you think how much better technology was then in terms of her knowing where she was and how she was getting from A to B. So these guys, actually, when you think of someone like Sadler, he was probably clueless about where he was going once he got off the ground. So he was the first person to travel across the Irish Sea by balloon. And then one of the other early Irish innovators was a guy called George Fitzgerald. He was a Trinity professor, and he was obsessed with the idea of flying. So he built several gliders, which he tried to fly on in College Park there in Trinity, just along Nassau Street. So he got a whole pile of his students involved in trying to pull. So he effectively had the gliders on ropes, so they'd be trying to pull the gliders. I'm not sure whether that, if you helped you, that increased your chances of getting an A grade or not. There's no evidence to point to that, but he got his students to help him, but he didn't do particularly well, and he eventually abandoned it. But it always, when I first started doing some research into the history of Irish aviation, it really struck me how amazing it was that Crosby, when you think about it, it was only a year and 3 months after the first flight with the Montgolfier brothers, he flew from Ranelagh to Clontarf. That was very, very early on in the history of flight that we had Irish people making very significant strides.
Yeah, and when you're talking about innovators and kind of the impact that people have had, you mentioned Earhart there a second ago. And so, in terms of the early pioneers here in Ireland, obviously Lillian Bland is someone that we always think to.
Yeah, Lillian is an incredible story, and I think I'm particularly fond of Lillian Bland and her story because Lillian actually lived very close to where I'm from, I'm from a place called White Abbey, just outside Belfast, and she would have tested her aircraft on Carnmoney Hill, which would have been in my eye line throughout my childhood. I wasn't aware that she existed when I was a young fella. No one where we lived was aware of Lillian's existence. She kind of been forgotten about. Lillian, there should be a movie about Lillian, I think, she's an incredible character. She was effectively the first woman in the world to design and build and fly her own aircraft. And she did that in August of 1910. She tested the aircraft, as I say, in Carnmoney Hill, but she flew it for the first time in Randallstown in County Antrim in a big estate that was owned by a friend of the family. So Lillian was born in Britain, but she was from an Irish family, and her mother passed away, and then she moved to Carnmoney to live with an aunt, and she had an uncle who was very interested in flying. He'd sent her a postcard of an early plane, and she became terribly obsessed by this. So she ordered the parts of an aircraft off she built it herself rather, but she ordered an engine off AV Avro, very famous subsequently engine manufacturers in Manchester. And this in a way speaks greatly about the kind of person Lillian was. She apparently was so peeved at the slow progress of the engine being delivered that she took the boat and the train herself to Manchester to collect her engine. And they hadn't yet perfected it, and she brought it back on the train to power her plane. And they hadn't yet figured out how a proper mechanism to get the fuel into the engine that she had. So her aunt was hard of hearing, and she used apparently her aunt's hearing aid. If you imagine an old kind of hearing aid that looks effectively like a funnel, so they used this to get the fuel into the engine. And one of the other reasons I really love Lillian is she named her aircraft Mayfly, as in may fly, may not fly. But she didn't go huge distance, but she was pretty much the first woman in the world to design, build, and fly her own aircraft. When she was doing that, Amelia Earhart, who obviously is world famous, was 12 years old. So she was a complete trailblazer, Lillian. And she's been kind of reclaimed a bit recently, and people talk about her more and have more knowledge about her. But she was kind of almost forgotten about. Again, there is a park on Carnmoney Hill near where she tested her aircraft, which is named in her honor, and there's a sculpture there. But I'm pretty sure if you went out and stopped 100 people on the road, either in Belfast or Dublin, and asked them had they heard of her, most people would never have heard of her still. There's definitely a good sort of documentary, I would think, in Lillian. She's a fascinating character. And actually and maybe this is one of the reasons she wasn't so celebrated, that shortly afterwards she abandoned flying. Her father was apparently appalled at the idea that his polite Anglo-Irish daughter would be doing terrible things like flying. She also smoked and wore trousers, which apparently were a very bad form for a lady back in 1910. And he was faintly appalled by all of this. So in order to stop her flying, he offered to buy her a car. So he bought her a car to stop her flying. And I think he was deeply unimpressed because she then ended up racing the car at speed. She was also a journalist for a while. She was then married off to, I don't know if it was a first cousin or certainly a cousin. She was married off to a relation, and they emigrated to Canada. And she lived most of the rest of her life in Canada. And if you Google her, and you might have to look around a bit, but you will find them. She took fantastic photographs of the native North American people in the part of Canada she was living in, which you can still find online. And then she came back. I think her husband passed away then, and she ended her life living in, I think, somewhere in Cornwall, where again, if you look online, you should be able to find there are a couple of BBC radio interviews with her that were done shortly before she passed away, by which time people, I think, had rediscovered this amazing thing that she did. She was an amazing character by all accounts.
And like you're saying that she's perhaps not as well remembered today as she could, and by the sounds of it really should be, but like kind of in, I guess, decades gone past, for say someone like Lady Mary Heath, would she have been an inspiration?
Yeah, she would have also been, again, wouldn't be as celebrated, arguably, as she should be. And it's funny, I'm not quite sure why this comes to pass. It's not. In some cases in history, you find, and it's a perennial problem, that women who were involved in history were forgotten about, in part because they were women. But in sort of the mists of Irish aviation history, people have been forgotten about from both sexes. So it's kind of an equal opportunities forgetfulness, that we haven't really celebrated Crosby as much as we should. We hadn't celebrated Mary Heath. Mary Heath was at one point was world famous, actually, and she had that kind of fame that Lillian didn't have, because she was so well known for her racing. But again, sort of slipped out of consciousness, really, and wouldn't be as well known as possibly she should be. There was a book that came out last, I think just before COVID. There was a book which a chap whose name eludes me momentarily he spent a long time writing and researching. So it's a kind of 2-volume series about the history of Irish female aviation pioneers, petticoats pilots, and something else. I think it's called from memory. You should be able to find it in the library, but it covered a range of stories, like Mary Heath, like Lillian Bland, and a number of other people who just did amazing things in the early part of the century. And as I say, we were punching above our weight. Like, if you think Lillian was flying that plane in 1910, that's only 7 years after the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. And also she was 6 months after. Harry Ferguson was the first Irishman to fly a powered aircraft. So that was in the end of December in 1909. It was him and his brother in Hillsborough in County Down. So Lillian was only a few months afterwards, and it's an amazing feat, that to do what she did.
It sounds it, absolutely. And so, kind of looking at 1910 Ireland, or kind of what was going on at that point, like, did we have a large level of military aviation activity happening, or what was that side of the world like?
Not so much 1910, but it would have come very quickly afterwards. So obviously, as obviously Ireland was within the British Empire at the time, and you would have had the period in the run up to the start of the First World War where Britain and Germany were both arming themselves and kind of engaging. It was mainly focused in the run up to the war. It was kind of a gunboat arms race where they were building larger and larger boats. But both of the powers began to realize the importance of aviation. And they particularly began to realize the importance of aviation after the war started, because they could see that huge progress wasn't being made on the battlefield, and using aviation could entirely transform things. So as far back as I think it was 1912, the British formed the Royal Flying Corps, which was effectively it was sort of the predecessor of the RAF. They ended up merging with the RAF I think in 1917, from memory, maybe 1918. And they were looking, once the war started, they started to look, the war started in 1914, they started to look for sites to train pilots and sites to develop flying skills. And they were looking at sites in Ireland. They thought that Ireland could work very well for them, because obviously they needed undeveloped land, and they needed a decent amount of land, and that's one thing we did have back then. And in a strange way, there were also other there were a series of strange events happened which came to pass, whereby the selection of airfields happened in Ireland. So what happened was, as I say, back in 1912, they formed the Royal Flying Corps. By 1916, they were pretty sure that Ireland, and they weren't looking at what was happening in Ireland, but they were pretty sure from their own military perspective, that Ireland would be good for air training. Already by the war, they had some military aircraft that had been moved to Ireland. So they had airships that were not normally stationed in Anglesey in Wales, but those airships had sort of off, kind of sub bases, one in Malahide Castle and one in Johnstown Castle, and they were set up in 1917. Now, I'm told, I haven't been able to find them, I'm told if you go to Malahide Castle and possibly Johnstown Castle, you can still find some of the old metal rings they would have had in the ground to tether the airship, because obviously they need that's effectively how they park them, or park being a totally incorrect word, but they tether them to large metal rings that have to have guys to pull them down. but apparently there are a couple of the rings still in Malahide Castle, in the grounds. So there were aircraft, or already in Ireland at that point, but they looked at Ireland as a site for military development. And what happened was, you could argue that some of a white horse played a large role in the selection of Irish military bases, because what happened was a guy called Sholto Douglas, who was a World War I pilot. He was taken off in the north of France in the fledgling Royal Flying Corps at the time. It was a very small operation, and he failed to do one of the basic. I've never flown. Well, I've flown in a plane, but I'm not a pilot. But he failed to do one of the basic things that all pilots have to do and still have to do to this day. They have to make a series of checks before they take off, in terms of checking their aircraft and checking all of that stuff. And they also kind of, when they're at the end of the runway, they also need to make a series of checks, just actual visual checks, to make sure that everything's fine and the way ahead is fine. And Sholto was taking off to try and intercept an aircraft and didn't do that. So he took off, and he didn't notice there was a white horse ploughing the field in front of him, and he hit the horse and injured himself greatly. And that's where Ireland comes into the story, because his father at that stage was the head of the National Gallery, who just moved to Dublin to replace Hugh Lane, who died in the sinking of the Lusitania. So German torpedo also had a role in this. And then Douglas was quite badly injured, and they sent him to Ireland to recuperate. And he was here, and he stayed here for a while. And then when he went back to the Royal Flying Corps, and probably because he'd been here already, someone decided that he was just the man to find some locations in Ireland to build our bases for military planes. So he flew an aircraft from London, I think, up through Scotland initially, and then down via the north and onto Dublin, landed at the Phoenix Park, and it was his aircraft was put effectively under armed guard, because of course by 1917, this was summer of 1917, we'd had the Easter Rising, and the entire environment was changing in Ireland in terms of the relationship with the British authorities. So the aircraft was under armed RIC guard at night, and then during the day he'd fly off into the air, and he'd have people on the ground had given him some indications of where he might be able to find sites. But it was Sholto Douglas who selected them. So he selected the site at Collinstown, which is now Dublin Airport, obviously. He also selected the site at Baldonnel. He selected the site at Aldergrove, which is now Belfast International. The site in Gormanstown, which was still an airfield. He picked a site in Fermoy, Cork, in Cookstown and Tala, and also at the Curragh. And all of those were developed into military bases. And the work happened very quickly. Like if you take, say, Dublin Airport, for example, or Collinstown, Aerodrome as it was. So the idea was that they were going to that it was quite a big development. I mean, that base was designed to house 72 aircraft. And by the middle of 1918, even though work only started in the latter part of 1917, by the middle of 1918, there were 800 people stationed at Collinstown. So it was a very significant development. They had airplane sheds, and they had an officers' mess, and a reception station, and people arriving. Did a women's hostel, and I'm not quite sure what function the women's hostel performed at the time, but I'm just reading that. I know that from reading an old map. And it was a very, very big base. Now, funnily enough, work was awkward timing for them in one sense. Work wasn't finished on the base until 1919, but of course by then the First World War rather had ended, so there wasn't such a requirement for a military base, and also things were changing very rapidly in Ireland. So what happened was, almost by the time the base was finished as an RAF base, because the Royal Flying Corps had become the RAF, it was surplus to requirements. So what happened then in Collinstown was that after the RAF departed, the British Army moved into Collinstown, and they used Collinstown until they then subsequently departed in 1922. And there was an interesting event in the spring of 1919. Collinstown was the scene of one of the biggest IRA raids at the time, where the IRA stole a huge amount of weapons from the British military at that point. And it was clearly an inside job, because they knew what they were looking for. And it was a very big job, because typically at that time, a lot of the IRA actions were quite small. You were looking at kind of a guerrilla warfare effectively. But the raid on Collinstown involved 50 men, so it was a very big operation, and I think they drugged the guard the guard dogs. They tied up some of the people, and then they escaped off into the countryside on bicycles, apparently. And obviously, at the time, it really was the countryside. That it was very far out from town, and it was effectively just fields, really.
Yeah, and then like it's incredible it's seeing the impact that one person and then subsequently the kind of the wider efforts and what is achieved in a very short space of time, given the amount of kind of challenge and unrest that's actually going on, like literally on the doorstep.
Yeah,
And
it's amazing they must have, to think of the actual, to have a structure whereby within almost a year, less than a year, just not much more than a year, there were 800 people there, and it never got fully built out in terms of the number of aircraft they planned it for, but it was a very big, I suppose that's the nature of the military to an extent, is particularly during wartime, they're probably on a footing whereby if they need something and they need it built, they just throw people at it.
and I remember I think it was open house or one of the events where you were opening the old terminal to the public a couple of years ago. I remember reading a sign as part of that saying, come and learn about the grandfather and the father of Collinstown. Who are they?
Yeah, well, I would say Sholto Douglas is the grandfather because he picked the site, and again, kind of largely forgotten. He actually, just a footnote to him, he's a very interesting character himself. He ended up being effectively the head of the RAF during the Second World War, and he kind of re-entered Dublin Airport history in the 1950s, I think 60s, when he was the chairman of one of the large number of kind of British regional airlines at the time. And when the market began to get liberalised, they were one of, I think it was BA. They entered the Irish market with service to the north of England, and Sholto was the chairman at the time. So I'm sure he would have come over to see the place he picked. But if Sholto's the grandfather, it's funny. Sean Lemass gets a lot of credit for Dublin Airport because Lemass was clearly had an outside view of the world and did many things that you could deem to be visionary things. But actually, Sean Lemass wouldn't be the person that credit with being the father of Collinstown. It's actually Alfie Byrne, who kind of gets written out of history. Alfie Byrne, the former Lord Mayor of Dublin, actually, someone could correct my incorrect historical fact. Trevor, your colleague, I know, would, because he wrote a biography of Alfie. I think Alfie started off as a Fianna Fáil politician, but then went independent because he had a falling out over something. Like, it was a split. I can't remember what the row was about. But Alfie was the Lord Mayor of Dublin at the time, and he was a classic kind of parish politician. And Alfie went to Lemass, who was in 1935, who was at the time the Minister for Industry and Commerce, with this grand idea of having a civilian airport, because actually what had happened is we'd had a military airport in Collinstown, we'd had a military airport in Baldonnel, we had one in Cookstown out in Tala, but they'd all kind of fallen into disrepair because the Free State wasn't really investing massively in an air force or in aviation. So the grass runways were still there at Collinstown, the buildings were there, but it had ceased to be an airport effectively. So Alfie went to Sean Lemass and pitched the idea of building a civilian airport for Dublin in 1935. Alfie's view was that it was in a way, it was like a lot of things that happened, infrastructure projects in the States at the time. He saw it as a relief project in a way. It was really bad unemployment in Ireland at the time, and particularly in Dublin. There was an economic war with Britain. The economy was doing really poorly. So Alfie saw this as a way of providing work. So he made his pitch to Sean Lemass. And this was a year before Aer Lingus had been set up. So he was quite visionary on Alfie's part. And Lemass effectively shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah, it sounds like a nice idea, but it's more of a matter for Dublin Corporation than the state. So the state, initially at least, the state wasn't going to put any funds in. It was going to be funded by the corporate. Lemass's view was that if you wanted to build it, the corporation should foot the bill. Now, that didn't transpire in the heel of the hunt. What happened eventually was that, from memory, I think it was a bit of a joint venture in terms of funding it. It was funded in part by the state and in part by Dublin Corporation. But it was Alfie Byrne whose idea it was to have the airport, who was the main proponent of the idea of the airport being at Collinstown. And again, Alfie is being more talked about as a character in part because of Trevor's book, and people are more interested in his exploits, but Alfie's connection with the airport has also kind of been forgotten about.
And then, so if you're saying this conversation starts in 35, obviously by the time they get around to building, we're facing into the emergency. Like, does that impact?
Yeah, the timing wasn't great. So yeah, they started to have, the government started to think about civil aviation. Alfie was, as I say, was very keen on Collinstown, so he made this suggestion in 35, and they in 1936 the state published the Air Navigation and Transport Bill. So that they set up, or it became an act rather, they set up Aer Lingus. And I think 6 or 7 days after they set Aer Lingus up, Aer Lingus had its first commercial flight, which actually is today. Today is the 85th anniversary of Aer Lingus's first flight. So Aer Lingus's first flight took off from Baldonnel, because they were still using Baldonnel, not from Collinstown. It took off from Baldonnel on the 27th of May in 1936, and they flew to Bristol Airport. And then around that time, but a few months later, 6-8 months later, the government set up the then Orienta, which became what is now DAA, and Orienta became the ultimate owner for many years of Aer Lingus, and then also the airport. So they were looking around for a site for Dublin Airport, and there was some debate about it. So obviously Aer Lingus had started in Baldonnel and continued to operate in the late 30s out of Baldonnel, albeit quite a limited service. Collinstown was an option, but they also looked at some other sites. Each site had its own proponents. Someone suggested the Phoenix Park, which I'm really glad they didn't take up as a site. And obviously they looked at it and said there's lots of land there, so you could have an airport there. They looked at that Cookstown site in Tala, which again was a site that Sholto Douglas had picked. They considered Kildonan and Finglas, which is actually connected to Lady Mary Heath, who we talked about earlier. Kildonan had been where a guy called from memory Pierce Cahill, who's Iona Airways. He was a mechanic in Phibsborough, and he was really interested in aviation. So he would have had a kind of a fledgling airport out there. That was an option. But my favourite option that they had that someone advanced for Dublin Airport was they had a plan to infill Sandymount Strand to build an airport there. And there was an engineer by the name of Desmond McAteer who came up with this cunning plan. And actually, if you're really interested, you can go and look. He wrote a piece about it, and he even had little hand drawings for an article in a magazine called Studies Magazine, which you can find online from March of 1935. So he had it's great actually. So he infills the Sandymount Strand, and he has his aerodrome. He has a design for an amusement park right beside the aerodrome. But my favorite thing that he had was he has a big area right basically at the end of the runway where he's going to build lots of houses right beside the airport, which wouldn't have been a very clever idea. It's really lucky that actually we didn't opt for that plan, because Dublin in some ways is very fortunate. A lot of cities all over the world, in Europe and elsewhere, eventually had to move airports because they picked and designed their airport in the 1930s, quite often in a location that made entire sense in the 1930s, but the city, both aviation grew and the city grew, and then the airport was either in the wrong place or was too small and couldn't be expanded. But we're very fortunate, that by picking Collinstown, which was already on the edge of the city, and obviously the city has expanded out to meet Collinstown, so it's no longer in the middle of nowhere, but it's still the people who were behind the original plan had huge foresight, because A, it was in the right location for the long-term plans, and B, as far back as the 1960s, the state secured significant amounts of additional land with the plan that at some point in the future there would be a parallel runway system. So land was acquired in the 60s and 70s for a runway system, which we didn't build we didn't start building until relatively recently, but the land was there. And if you look at, it's funny, if you think about the early flights out of Ireland to London, say, Heathrow and Gatwick didn't exist as airports then. It was to Croydon or to and that's if you look at an airport like, say, Lisbon Airport faces a very significant problem in the medium term, where they'll probably have to figure out what are they going to do. Are they going to keep it as a city airport and then expand somewhere else? Because over the longer term, they're just not going to have enough space to expand in the way that they want to expand. And that has happened to lots of airports, whereas we've been fortunate and that didn't happen. So eventually the plan was for for Collinstown. They started work in 37, laying out the grass runways. It was about, there are lots of streams that run through the airfield, so they had to dig lots of culverts to take the streams away, and they kind of flattened the land and put the runways down, and then they also had to obviously to deliver a terminal building. And there was a big, as is often the case with any state investment, as it was at the time, there was much debate about this. There were two very distinct camps. There was we need to build a building which basically talks about this new state's position in the world and reflects our position in the world, was one camp, and the other camp was, we need to build something really cheap because we haven't got any money. And the let's build something which talks about our position in the world camp won out. And actually the terminal building, which the airport opened on January the 19th, 1940, which people who've been paying real attention, if there are any, might remember is January the 19th is also the date of Richard Crosby's first flight. Now, it's funny, I can't, there is a history of Dublin Airport, a book that records lots of the history, and in that, it doesn't say specifically that they chose that date, but it just seems like too big of a coincidence to happen on, so I presume someone at a point said when they were working to open the facility that, hey, let's go for January the 19th because that's the date of Crosby's flight, or it was an amazing coincidence of all the days that happened to be that day. So but when the airport opened in January the 19th, there was a single flight that day, an Aer Lingus transferred from Baldonnel to Dublin Airport, or Collinstown it was known then, in 1940, and the first flight was a Lockheed 14 flights, very small aircraft at the time, to Liverpool. And right through those war years, or the emergency as it was called in the Republic of Ireland, which obviously didn't exist until after that, the emergency as it was called in the Free State, we effectively had one or two flights a week, really, and you obviously you had to be a hardy soul, I guess, to have taken a commercial flight from neutral Ireland to Britain at that point, because we either had flights to Liverpool or to Barton Aerodrome in Manchester, and the airport that you arrived at would be largely dependent on the security situation at the time as to where it was most safe to fly to. The airport was effectively mothballed during the war years. The Irish Army was stationed there. There's a Collins Barracks, which is obviously now reopened again. So if you go to Collins Barracks, there's an anti-aircraft gun in the military section of Collins Barracks. It's a Swedish-made Bofors gun, which was at Collinstown throughout the war, and actually that, I don't know if it's that exact one, but certainly the anti-aircraft guns at Collinstown would have fired on the German aircraft that bombed the North Strand and other places in Dublin by mistake. They would have been fired upon by the guns at Dublin Airport, because obviously Dublin Airport during those war years was a hugely strategic asset, because if anyone was going to invade, and we were in danger of being invaded by either the British, who may have invaded us as they sought to retreat from the advancing Allied forces, and also obviously the Germans had a plan to invade Ireland and attack in a kind of pincer movement to attack Britain from the back door. And either of those forces, had they decided to invade, the first place they would have needed to take first would have been Dublin Airport. So there were, up until relatively recently, there were the remnants of concrete pillar boxes that also had been built during the war. But yeah, the building and the airport was pretty much mothballed during the war. A few flights, and I should say that the terminal design of the terminal was awarded to a very young architect called Desmond Fitzgerald, who I think it was basically his first major commission out of college. So he had graduated from UCD. He'd done his thesis for college, or for his degree, was on the design of an airport terminal, because they were the new kind of sexy thing in architecture at the time. But interestingly, the airport terminal that he designed for his thesis didn't look anything like what he ended up designing for Dublin. What he did for his thesis apparently was much more of an angular kind of a red, I think it may have been red brick, but it was much more of an angular building. It didn't have the curves and the very famous curves of the terminal at Collinstown. and I'm not an architect, but there's a bit of a debate within architectural circles as to who actually designed the building. Certain people would argue that yes, it was Fitzgerald and it was he alone. There's another school of thought that argues that actually Fitzgerald led a team of architects, many of whom had a much greater impact in the design of the building. But what's not disputed is the quality of the building. It's an amazing piece of architecture. It's one of the most important piece of architecture in the state. It won awards at the time, and obviously it did. The award it won, it wasn't celebrated in the way it should have been because there was a war on, and actually the plans for the building and even coverage of the building, it wasn't really covered in the media until after the end of the war. But I'm privileged. I haven't been in it obviously that much in the last 14 months, but I'm really privileged that my office at the airport is in that building, and there's something magical. I was in it today actually. There's something magical about walking into that double height check-in space that was the original check-in in that building. It's still a fantastic building. It's filled with light, and it's designed. The reason why it's curved is, if you think about a curve, but by having it curved, they were trying to create as much space as possible to park the aircraft on the rear of the building. But one of the really lovely things about the curved design of it, and I think it's probably accidental, was that if you think about the curve in reverse, it's almost like the building is putting its arms around you. It's kind of curving in a welcome as you approach the building. And a lot of the stuff in that building is still entirely intact. So the handrails, some of the not the light fittings themselves, but some of the light controls are exactly as they were. And much of the internal, certainly the double height space check-in hall, looks very much like it did in the old shots from the 50s. One of the few changes is that originally you'd arrived in and you'd have had a safe check-in. There'd have been somewhere where you got weighed, because back then they weighed not just your luggage, but they also weighed you, because they needed to ascertain basically to distribute the weight properly across the aircraft, because they were small aircraft. So you get weighed. There was a little post office. There was a little bank. But you'd effectively check in and you'd walk straight through into departures. So if you enter that building now, one of the only significant changes is that all of those kind of gaps in the wall where you previously would have walked through to go through departures, they're now filled in with glass bricks, because that the building is still we still actually use it, and there are still departure gates in that terminal, which, it's funny, it's quite hard to check this, but I'm pretty sure, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I'm pretty sure that is the oldest terminal building in Europe, which is still used in part by passengers. Now, it's not necessarily used by passengers every day. Those boarding gates aren't constantly in use, but there are boarding gates in that building. And actually, you have to, people who know the airport very well would know they're in those boarding gates. But when things do get back to something approaching normal, you'll know you're in it when you see there are photographs of the inside of the building, and photographs of the building on the wall. But it's a magnificent building, and it's a real, as I say, it's a privilege to walk through the door of that building. And again, when you look at the materials they would have had and trying to build that structure during the war, when they only it was effectively finished during the early part of the war, but there were certain things they couldn't get, that they had to wait until wartime kind of shortages ended. But in a way, that terminal is a microcosm for what's happened in aviation right across Ireland and many countries in Europe, where we had a big debate about was that building too big? Was that building too small? Would we ever need that amount of people, a building for that amount of people? And by the end of the 1940s, it was already too small.
And it's funny actually, because I had never, I remember you kind of giving me a tour of the old terminal a few years ago, and anyone I met so vividly remembered the enthusiasm and the kind of the pride in showcasing what a spectacular building it actually is that was there. I had never heard the idea of the building being shaped like the hug, and there's something that kind of speaks to the Irish kind of Céad Míle Fáilte in that.
Well, it's funny. That's me describing it. That I feel it that way. I'm not necessarily sure. I've never seen it written anywhere. That's the reason they designed it the way they did. The curved shape was to allow as much space as possible for aircraft to park. I think the hug is an accidental byproduct, but I do see it that way.
Yeah.
It feels like the building is giving you a hug as you head up as you drive up or walk up towards the front of it. And actually, the gardens, the the gardens outside the building, and the way in which the road is structured are exactly as they were rather when the building opened. Now we had to, at a point when we did some works, we had to replace part of the gardens, but actually we reconstructed them exactly as they were. So if you go there now, if you're there this evening and you look at the way the rockeries are and the way they're designed, you can see they're exactly the same. They're exactly the same rockeries that were there in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
And
Everything
then,
else has changed, but it doesn't change.
but it's that in itself is something worth protecting. But then, like when we come to the 70s, I think it's the early 70s, we come to the building of Terminal 1. Like, what's going on in Dublin at the time, and what leads to the creation of Terminal 1?
Yeah, like growth in traffic, really, and it's funny. Before we even got to Terminal 1, we had several other sort of additions. So, what are now piers, they used to be called piers A and B. They're now the 200 gates and the 300 gates for people who cast your mind back to when you could use the airport. But what are the 200 gates and 300 gates, which were originally known as piers A and B? So they were long kind of fingers of boarding gate areas. They predated the construction of Terminal 1. They were actually built in the 1960s. So we had very significant construction then. And then if you imagine there were kind of two long elements, if you think two long rulers that sort of headed out like this, Terminal 1 was then built to sit almost to abut them, so that it kind of sat like that, and then it connected with those. So we had very significant amounts of traffic growth. And the other thing which changed massively, and it relates in part to that thing I was talking about earlier, but the way in which the building was designed to park aircraft. If you think about this, the size of aircraft when that building was being designed. So the first flight was a Lockheed flight to Liverpool. From memory, and I could be wrong, I think that aircraft could take 12 or possibly 14 passengers. So the aircraft had changed entirely by the 60s. You could almost have fitted one of those small original aircraft in the belly hold of an aircraft. And the size of airports, people often complain about walking distances at airports and large airports. And walking distances, it's not that we want to make people walk longer. We're concerned about their fitness. The reason that generally the airports have long walks is there are very, very strict rules about the way in which you park an aircraft, and wingtip to wingtip, and the distance between them, and all sorts of safety things that have to be done. And that's why boarding gate piers tend to be quite long, because you're walking along the length of the boarding gate, because the aircraft are parked side by side, and the walk distances in all large airports are generally dictated by the way in which you park the aircraft. So the main reason why the airport had to expand was twofold. One, it was passenger numbers had increased massively as our travel became more and more normal. If you think back to, it's funny, I kind of joke sometimes, if you look at the old pictures of the airport in the 60s and 50s, fantastic pictures of the restaurants or the cafe. In several of those pictures, lurking in the background is either a nun or a priest. And I kind of I've joked before with colleagues that it was obviously a bylaw that you had to have a member of the clergy in any photograph. But actually, the reason that quite often there's a nun or a priest in those photographs, that obviously back then the missions were a huge thing in Ireland, and missionaries were a big part of Irish culture. But also, if you think about it, not that many people would have been traveling by air, whereas they would have had the wherewithal to go to travel off to Africa or wherever it was they were traveling. I think about my own childhood. I'm 53. When I was young, airline travel wasn't for the likes of us. It just wasn't. It was not a thing that was. No one that I knew went on holidays by plane. They didn't. Other people did, but we didn't. And no one that we knew did. So there was a kind of a democratization of airline travel that was beginning to start on a small way as you moved into the 1960s and 70s and the kind of birth of package holidays. So there was a huge boom, and actually, arguably, the airport here would have expanded much greater and much more quickly had we not had the issue with the troubles in the north, because obviously that had a big impact on the ability to draw passengers from North America, particularly. And obviously that was an issue with, was an awkward timing thing with Terminal 1. And again, I mean, it's funny, you look at Terminal 1, it opened in 1972, and people might look at it now and they may view it as quite, I suppose, let's be brutal, but that's a terrible pun given its brutalist architecture. Some people would view it as quite an ugly building, but it's very much of its time. That was cutting edge architecture at the time. And if you look at the original photographs of it in situ, before things happened that changed around it, it actually, you can see what they were trying to do. But I'm not a fan of brutalist architecture. I'm not. So I don't lie awake at night dreaming about how lovely it is. But it was the workhorse of the airport for decades, and it saw us through booms and busts, and it is very much, it's funny, you could find lots of other airport buildings that are very much like that, but the troubles did have an impact in terms of the way and even in which that building was used. I mean, people are sometimes curious about the spirals that are attached to Terminal 1 and what they are. The two top floors of that terminal were originally a multi-story car park.
No way.
Yeah, for the public, and you accessed those two floors of car parks via the spirals. But once the troubles happened, and there were bombs at Dublin Airport, we had to look at that, and it just, from a security perspective, it didn't make sense to have a scenario whereby you could have someone parking their car in the terminal. So it ceased to be a public car park, and you can still, we have a very small amount of parking for certain staff who need to park very near there for a number of reasons, and so you can still access a small parking area via those spirals. And it's funny, they're one of those funny things that they're a bit like the Poolbeg chimneys. They were built for a very specific reason, but they've now kind of become an icon. The spirals are very much an icon of Dublin Airport, despite the fact that most people don't actually know what they're for. But they're a very central part of the, I think if you ask people about Dublin Airport and they think about how it looks, and the things that strike them initially, the things that they think about are things like now very much T2, because it's and that journey underneath the center of T2 as you head to T1, it's very,
I still remember the first time I experienced it. I remember it was a feeling of awe. You did, it did make quite a statement as far as a piece of architecture goes. And it kind of, I guess that kind of brings us slightly closer to kind of recent history. And like, when you look at what you and your colleagues have seen in the airport over the last kind of 10, 15 years, like, what have been the key modern history kind of changes, or the innovations in aviation in Ireland?
The real thing that I think over the last kind of 10, 12 years that we saw, in a way it was kind of linked to Terminal 2, that, maybe it's just one of these things that we have this, there are awkwardnesses, there's awkward timing when we open a terminal, just as, the original terminal was opened during the war. Terminal 2 was opened in the middle of the greatest recession that we'd ever seen. And if you cast your mind back, I can vividly remember certain people saying we should close it, we should mothball it would never be used, it would never be full. And the nature of an airport, and it's the same, funny, you can really see it with Terminal 1 and with the original terminal. The nature of an airport investment is you're not investing for a year or two, you're investing for decades. And one of the real thing, I think, even people like ourselves who were completely sure that Terminal 2 would be the answer to the problem, not the problem, when people were saying, oh, well, there's a downturn, we shouldn't do this. I think we were even surprised at the speed with which and aviation always recovers. Aviation will recover from the current position. It recovered from the oil crisis. It recovered from the recessions of the 1980s. It recovered from the last recession. but I think we were surprised at the speed of the recovery. We recovered very, there was a huge hit. There was a hit for a couple of years, and then we not only did we recover, but we surpassed the previous heights in terms of passenger numbers. And what we also ended up doing was, and I think people don't realize this, there's a funny thing about air travel. If you live in Ireland and you want to fly from Dublin to pick whatever city it is, you don't ever look and see what options would you have if you flew from Brussels instead. No one ever does that with air travel. It would make no sense. Which means that if you live in a particular place, you don't really have much of a concept of how your city or your country benchmarks against other countries in terms of connectivity, because you never really look at anyone else's market. And people, I think, don't particularly realize here that we massively punch above our weight in terms of connectivity, and we've really built on that in the years, kind of the decade up to 2019, in terms of adding new routes and services, scenarios whereby we'd have several flights to the Middle East. We added new routes to Asia Pacific, to Beijing, to Shanghai, to Hong Kong. And, we added cities working with our airline customers. We added cities in North America that people thought we'd never have direct flights to, and if you go back, if you cast your mind back even just kind of 10, 15 years ago, there were there would have been very few. Dublin might have had 3 or 4 cities in North America that we had flights to, and there might have been summer only, whereas that expanded massively. And part of that is to do with the evolution in aircraft and changes in aircraft. So it's now feasible, not feasible, it's a fact that you can fly a narrow-bodied aircraft from Dublin to a lot of cities in North America, which you couldn't do before. You had, you simply couldn't do that with a narrow-bodied aircraft. So you had to have a bigger plane. The economics of making a route sustainable have now entirely changed, because you can fly a much smaller aircraft. That means you can operate routes that have much, a much smaller base in terms of passenger demand. So, if you take an example, say WestJet, the Canadian airline, they operate narrow-body aircraft. They'd never flown any transatlantic service until they launched their service to Dublin, and they flew from Newfoundland to Dublin. And I remember when it was launching, talking to a journalist here who said, who's going to fly to Newfoundland? Who would go to Newfoundland? And I said, well, actually, I'd quite like to go to Newfoundland. I always fancied it. But already by the time it had been, I was chatting to them, it had been on sale in I think for like a week or two, and we'd picked up that almost all the flights were already full, and they were full from the Canadian side, because there was just a huge demand, because they were able to sell. They're a low-cost airline. They were selling tickets at prices that people in Newfoundland had never seen before, and also they were able to fly at that point from Newfoundland rather than having to fly to Montreal or Toronto or whatever. So aircraft technology has opened up all sorts of new routes that weren't previously possible. And also the other thing we have in Dublin, which is a fantastic advantage for us on the North American context, is to have US CPP. So you can fly to lots of other airports. You have to fly to very specific American airports that have all of the processing for immigration and customs and border protection there, whereas you do all that here in Dublin. So you can arrive, and you can actually land pretty much at any airport in America that you want to, because you've done all of the logistics, and all of the state services are done here. But I think the biggest change in the last few years has been, and that's only going to continue to change as aircraft evolve. They're becoming much, much more fuel efficient. They're becoming much quieter, and as they become more fuel efficient, and you get smaller aircraft being able to fly longer distances, it entirely changes the route dynamics, and it makes routes that previously would not have made sense, make sense for the airline, because ultimately we're facilitators. We facilitate our airline customers flying from A to B. Any airlines are, they're all commercial businesses in the main. Their job and what is to fly people from A to B, but to make as much money as they can while doing so. And what they're interested in is having a route which generally will have people at both ends that want to travel on a mix of business, particularly on a longer haul flight. They want a mix of business and leisure passengers, because obviously the economics of the route mean that on a long haul flight, the people who are traveling in business class or first class, if the airline has that, they're subsidizing the cost of the tickets for everyone else. So you need to have a mix of passengers. But yeah, the aircraft. So
sorry, I just see loads of people kind of writing in saying that they're really enjoying listening to you, and I'm kind of selfishly a question that I just definitely want to ask you, so I'm rudely cutting you off before I don't miss my chance. We curated an exhibition on aviation in Ireland a few years ago, and we have never had more calls and more people wanting to share their own stories than when we did. And it's, I can imagine the number of passengers that turn around and tell you stories and kind of share their memories on an ongoing basis. But I guess I'd love to know from your own perspective, what are the days or the memories or what are the moments in the airport that you'll never forget?
It's funny. It's, one of the wonderful things about the airport and any airport is that you kind of, I often get slightly, every at Christmas sometimes I occasionally get miffed where people arrive out to the airport and say, oh, it's like that scene in Love Actually, and I'm like, no, you've got it wrong. Love Actually just takes scenes from an airport. We are the place where the love and the emotion happens. They just stole that for their movie. It's not like a scene it's the other way around. And it is, you see people at their best, at their worst. And, I'm a people watcher. In normal times, if I walk to the terminal, I'm going to pass Sandwich, or I'm on the way from one meeting to another, people walk past, I'll do that thing that everyone does. And I'll kind of look and think, oh, why is he traveling? I wonder where's he from? Where's he going? And the memorable days, I think my colleagues will talk about it, things like, there are all sorts of different memories, like what the day, like I can, remember my own personal memories. I can remember being there on a grey day where we put up the first piece of steel for Terminal 2. And we didn't have a big ceremony. It was just it was some it was kind of 5 guys in a crane, doing working in a way with structural steel that it's totally different from what I do. And I look at people like that and I'm just so in awe of someone that has the skills to do things. That I think of something like that you think of days like Olympic homecomings, Christmas. Actually, any Christmas, I'm a huge softie. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to be moved when you walk through the airport at Christmas, particularly if you're at a time where someone's particularly the long haul flights, in a funny way, because the nature of that is it's obvious they're further away, so people have generally seen the gap between people seeing each other is wider. So maybe if you'd be walking through Terminal 2 and some of the flights are coming in from the Middle East, which would bring a lot of people from Australia, New Zealand who'd have changed, and people would be they'd be seeing grandchildren for the first time, and it's amazing. Certainly, when I at a point in the future when I'm doing something else, if I think back, that'll be one of the things I'll always take with me, just the privilege of being there on one of those days at Christmas where it just everything is. If you could bottle that atmosphere and that love, it sounds trite, but just if you haven't been there, it's just it's a really amazing place to be. And it's funny, again, it's one of those things. I think sometimes we think it's like that in lots of other airports, and I'm not necessarily sure that it is. I think it's a bit different here. So there's that, and funny, if again I'm talking personally, those days that you referenced earlier, those I really enjoy doing those open house tours, or it's really nice to be able to share that building with the general public, because unfortunately it isn't a public building. It's so, and what we generally find in those every year, so they're unfortunately you can't, some open house things you can just arrive and pitch up, but because of the nature of the building we have to have guided tours and limit the amount of people, and it's always massively oversubscribed. But every year we do it, we always have people who have worked in the building who come back, and it's lovely to hear that, we learn from them, to hear their stories. And one of the first years we did it, there was a lovely old man who was telling me that the office, which now houses our HR department, used to be called the Blue Room because that was where our traffic control was, and the computer screens were blue and they had big black curtains. We've had other people talking about how they had their wedding, how they had their wedding breakfast there, or reminiscing about particular dates they had out at the airport. Because of course, the restaurant in the airport, the Collar of Gold, it was the hot ticket for many years. It was the best restaurant in the city. It wasn't in the city, but it was the best restaurant in Dublin. And even people would go to the airport. It seems strange now just to think of this, but people would go to spend the day at the airport. They'd go out to the airport and they'd maybe have a cup of tea and they'd watch the planes because it was just so exotic and glamorous. Because it was just so different from what was probably at the time quite a drab and dreary life compared to the kind of lives that we all lead now.
And I'm not going to lie, when the county-wide travel returned after the last lockdown, my partner and myself drove from one side of the city, or from the other side of the city, across to the airport just to have a look. And it's the novelty of it. And I think it's somewhere that's really very important to us all. And just the picture that you're painting of really just emotive, honest human moments, and just seeing love in its rawest form.
Yeah, well, we've all kind of thought about this, when, and hopefully we'll have some very good positive news and, from the government tomorrow in terms of the reopening. But when we do reopen properly, if you thought Christmas at Dublin Airport was emotional, when people come home who haven't been home in a year and a half or 2 years, it's just, and people will, there'll be all sorts of emotions. There'll be, there will be grandchildren who won't have been seen before. There'll have been people who got married. So, it'll be amazing. It really will be amazing.
Yeah, and I think on behalf of, I guess, every citizen living in Ireland who has family overseas, but also, the museum and kind of tourism industry who are so desperately looking forward to the day that international travel returns as well. We have a lot to hopefully do together to kind of work towards the next chapter and to rebuild together in the next few months and years. But I think kind of going back to where you started at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned this idea that Ireland has long punched above its weight in a lot of ways, and I would dare hope we continue to do that into the next chapter. And that's been an incredibly fast hour, and I'd love to stay here and continue the conversation for the rest of the evening. But Paul, you've been so incredibly generous with your thoughts and with your stories. Sincerely, thank you so much.
Oh, it's been really nice to talk to you. Thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I sincerely appreciate it. And to everyone who's been here with us, we've had guests joining us from Buenos Aires and Poland, and I dare say a few places in between. So to everyone who's...
Hopefully we'll get to go to those places again soon.
counting down the days. But I guess that's it from us this evening. So to everyone who's been here, thank you so much. And that's it for another week of 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. But just on behalf of us all, Paul O'Kane, the Chief Communications Officer with the DAA, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Good evening.